Hi there, welcome back to our learning series on core concepts in human rights. This is the second half of the course. If you haven't caught the first half, please head over to that first video in order to get the necessary context and information to go through this video. So in the first half, we covered the history and context of human rights. We looked at rights at an international level before taking it a little bit closer to home with the UK and Scottish context. So what we're going to be doing now is talking about the role of the third sector in human rights, as well as looking at some practical frameworks that you can take forward in your work. So we're going to start off by looking at the role of the third sector in human rights. We have identified three key roles that the third sector plays. The first one being fulfill people's rights through providing support and services. The second one is inform, raise awareness among staff and service users on their rights and tools available to defend them. And lastly, advocate, use influence to advocate for people's rights. Now we're going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail and give you some examples of what that looks like, and maybe you can start to see yourself in each of these roles. Let's take a look at fulfill first of all, and how third sector organisations help to fulfill people's rights through support and services. So if we look at a few of the key functions that third sector organisations provide, we can see really clear links to rights. So first of all, food banks, obviously that is helping people to access the right to food. In providing benefits advice, so you can look at the Citizens Advice Bureaus, that obviously helps people to access their right to social security. Care services help people to access their right to health. Legal aid in helping people access the right to a fair trial, and those that provide access to the arts in terms of the right to culture. So there's a really clear link there in how third sector organisations can help people to fulfil their rights. And while these are organisations that are helping meet people's immediate needs, they ultimately do underscore where there is a government or state failure to uphold rights. The Trussell Trust, for example, an organisation that supports people that are experiencing hunger and food poverty, they have said that they shouldn't have to exist. For them to exist is a sign that the government is failing to do their job properly. So there are other instances, of course, where third sector organisations are being directly funded by the public sector to provide public services. So there is a bit more nuance there, but as a whole, the third sector is providing a function that is addressing a gap in rights provision. So that's something that is important for organisations that are doing that work to actually recognise in yourselves, and that what you're doing is human rights work, and to be able to speak about it in those terms. It can be beneficial for a number of reasons, from the more business-minded reasons in terms of applying for funding, but also for demonstrating the value of the third sector to the public sector, and that we're really helping to bridge that gap in human rights provision for many people. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a video from an organisation called SeeChange. They support people with learning disabilities to live fuller lives, and they speak of themselves as a human rights organisation, and they frame their work in terms of human rights.
Human rights are fundamental to me personally on a political level, and also to the organisation. It's a framework that provides a steely core to what you do. So when we talk to the people that we work for, we're not doing them a favour as an organisation, as a charity, affording them the opportunity to vote, or to live independently, or to have a relationship, or to maintain relationships with family members. We're actually manifesting their rights. We're supporting them to do what everyone else has the right to do. The United Nations panel approach gives you a good structure, a good measure to kind of check the working of the organisation. And at all points we have to take time to listen to the people that we work for, to ensure that we are continually realigning our practice.
Because it's very easy to champion human rights without actually being able to put it into practice. What immediately struck me is that SeeChange is very person-centred, so you can't help but uphold someone's human rights when they're the one that's driving the whole process. So David has the right to be heard, choosing his own staff, how he spends his time, and what time the staff will spend with them. It all comes from David.
So what we do is run lots of different social events. So we do quite small scale things that maybe only have about 10-15 people, such as our art workshops.
We have a dating and friendship agency, Dates and Mates, and that's about providing opportunities for people with learning disabilities to get together. It's a really conscious effort to challenge the stereotypes of adults with learning disabilities as perpetual children, which is just nonsensical and doesn't fit with human rights.
Human rights are according to God, and now because I'm a company, I got a kind of life, kind of outlook on life, that my human rights are not held here better, because they know what I need and know what I want to do.
By thinking and using human rights as the frame for what you do, it provides a language that's a common language, not just locally but nationally and internationally. And when you start to talk about challenges or difficulties that people are experiencing and frame them within human rights, it helps people to try and come up with a solution to it. They inspire me. The conventions inspire me. I think they're written in those documents as our better selves, and that's why it's a guide for this organisation and for me personally.
So that was a lovely sea change about how their organisation fulfills human rights. I think they are a really, really great example in that they spoke about how they're not just doing people a favour by affording them the ability to go vote or to form friendships, but they're actually helping them to fulfil their human rights. And they spoke about how human rights really forms the core of what they do. And I think that can really be applicable across a lot of third sector organisations, in that, starting to think about yourselves as a human rights based organisation and reframing what you do is not just doing people a favour, but actually how you're helping them to achieve their critical and core human rights. It helps you to put your case across as an organisation that is doing really, really vital work in a great way.
The next one we're going to discuss here is Inform. So this refers to raising awareness amongst staff, volunteers, service users and trustees about their rights and making sure that they know about all the different tools available to defend those rights. We've got a video here to show you from an organisation called the Advocacy Project, which we really think demonstrates this function in action really, really well.
The Advocacy Project is a human rights based organisation. We help people to be able to express their wants and needs where perhaps they haven't been heard as well before. Human rights obviously underpin everything that we do. It's absolutely fundamental to upholding the rights of people who perhaps have been more marginalised in society. We now provide input into human rights and equality in our induction programme. We also run workshops regularly for staff in relation to human rights and equality. We have regular workers' forums where we discuss right-based issues in relation to their cases, and we use it as a way to inspire workers and to remember why they're in this job in the first place. We also have developed a tool derived from the Commission's FAIR approach and panel principles that gives workers a clearer way to think through human rights based issues. A really clear example of where a human rights based approach was used and proved very successful was with a woman called Patricia, who has mobility issues. She had been in hospital and had to bring a lot of her own equipment in from home, and a friend had to bring that for her. So the hospital had not at all considered the needs of people like Patricia.
Because I was so small, they didn't have the equipment necessary like a commode, a Zimmer and other items. I had to ask my friend to get a taxi to bring this equipment in, which to me was all wrong, because if you're going through an operation, it's traumatic enough to go through that operation without having to worry that your equipment's not there if you need to go to the loo. It makes you feel as if you're there to get the operation done, but you're not there for them to look after you properly. Surely it wouldn't have took them that much to get that equipment in, but because of that they said, oh no, we don't have that because you're too small, so you'll need to bring, if you've got it at home, bring it in. Now, nobody else had to do that in the hospital.
We were able to frame what had happened to Patricia in terms of human rights and equalities, that it certainly wasn't treating her with dignity and respect. And subsequently, the lead occupational therapist for that area has taken it on board, issued new policy, and the equipment needed has now been put in place in a number of hospitals around the city. Having knowledge of human rights enables you to understand more clearly what the duties are in relation to local authorities, health boards, etc., and how you should be treated and what you should expect. I think it's had an extremely positive impact. It increases the sort of capacity and confidence of workers in relation to addressing rights-based issues in their work. And it's also helped to make them realise that we don't expect them to be somewhat of a human rights lawyer. It's about being able to use the language and to understand what underpins it and how it applies to their work. And we've found that it's had really good results.
It means that you're a person, whether you be small or otherwise. And that's what I feel this is important, for people to accept us and accept the fact that we should be treated just as well as everybody else.
In this video, Patricia is a really great example of the power of information and awareness. Being supported by the Advocacy Project to think about her situation through a rights-based lens really gave her the tools and solutions to speak up when things went wrong. And it also allowed for solutions not just for herself, but for other people in her area that might have faced similar problems. This kind of having that information and awareness has a knock-on effect. It doesn't just apply to one part of someone's life. It can be more aware of your rights in general, can have a huge impact on people's lives. The Advocacy Project were able to offer that really direct one-to-one support for Patricia, but this isn't the only way that an organisation can make their service users aware of their rights. So, hark back to the Sea Change video, we can think about how they framed their work in a rights-based way, so we can all look at how we do this in our own organisation. We can also do things like helping with access to information through providing workshops on rights relevant to your work, or maybe putting up posters around your office, or signposting to relevant services. That can be a really great way of promoting awareness. You can also look internally, so looking at your staff and your volunteers, putting them on training, such as the kind of training that 3 provides for free, to really up your organisation's knowledge on rights topics. If you're able to, you can provide that one-on-one support like the Advocacy Project did with Patricia. That's always great, but not all organisations work in that kind of capacity. And at the end of the day, you're probably already doing rights-based work. So thinking about the language that you're using when you're doing that work is really important. If you're able to make it quite clear that your work is rights-based work, then it's clear to people that are taking up your services that they're there to kind of have their rights upheld and their rights respected and met by your organisation. That will then help them build that understanding that they are not someone that's just receiving a favour, but actually that they have rights, that they are rights holders themselves, and all of the work that you're doing to support them is part of their rights as a human being.
Finally, our last but definitely not least function, advocate, using influence to advocate for people's rights. This really just talks about the fact that third sector organisations have influence. We're often subject experts in the work that we do, or else we work directly with the subject experts themselves and have various opportunities to sit in positions of influence. Some of those spaces for influence are often places that not the general public will often be able to interact with. So when we think about our work across community planning spaces, policy making, cross-sector work, collaboration with the public sector, you might sit on an integration joint board, you might be involved in your health and social care partnerships. These are just some examples of places that third sector organisations have access to that not everyone does. And these are really great spaces to be able to bring in that rights-based influencing and advocacy in order to call upon rights and use that evidence and lived experience that you've come across in your work as well to inform decision making and policy agendas at a wider level. We also have the ability through the services themselves that we deliver to be the scene setters in a lot of ways. So, trying things in a different way, begin delivering services in slightly more innovative ways, and then using that to gather evidence of what works well and what isn't, and then using that to produce evidence of how rights-based approaches might produce better outcomes for people overall. Those are just some examples of how we can use the influence that we have in order to make change through rights-based ways. So, I'm just going to take a moment to talk about rights-based advocacy, or using rights in your arguments when you're talking about issues. It might not be the most intuitive thing to you, so I just wanted to take a bit of an aside to sort of talk about why we think it's important and how it can help you in these instances. So first of all, linking arguments back to legal obligations and duties. A lot of the time, actually, you might come across people in decision-making and policy spaces that actually aren't aware of their role as duty bearers, as people that actually are upholding people's rights. And so part of what you may be responsible for is actually raising awareness in these spaces. And so part of that messaging is that, these aren't just a nice thing to do, but actually it's about upholding the rights of people. And that can really add additional weight to what you're saying, that, this is legislation that needs to be paid attention to. Secondly, it allows you to draw upon international guidance and recommendations. Other countries around the world are following the same pieces of international law and working under the same conditions of human rights, and so this actually gives you access to other examples of good practice and examples to learn from. It can open the door to additional conversations. That's to say that talking about human rights is not necessarily going to fix all of the problems and immediately get you the solutions that you want. But it can help to open the doors to other conversations in which arguments such as, more emotional cases can be brought in. We've seen examples of instances where rights haven't been met, where politicians have actually then stepped in and other influential parties, because, having that language of human rights actually sometimes just has a power to it that tends to make people pay attention a little bit more and may be key to bringing some people or organisations on board who otherwise wouldn't have been. And finally, an additional method for creating accountability. Rights can provide an opportunity to get your concerns on record. So, for example, some local authorities are now doing integrated impact assessments or equality and human rights impact assessments. And if you're able to contribute to those in articulating your concerns about, let's say, new projects or funding decisions through rights-based language, then using an impact assessment can actually be an opportunity to get your concerns down on record, which even if you don't get the outcome that you hope for, you can come back to that later down the line and use that as a way to reassess decisions from the past, and having a written record of the fact that you have brought up a concern through these integrated impact assessments. So that's just a few examples of sort of why rights-based advocacy can be quite beneficial in certain spaces, because they can add legitimacy, add a bit more weight to the arguments that you're making. They can help to produce evidence-based sort of like concerns, and you can draw upon international guidance and recommendations as well. So I realised that was quite a lot of talking about hypotheticals, but it might be useful to give you a couple of examples of rights-based advocacy in action to kind of give a bit of life to how that might work in practice. I've got 2 examples up on screen. The one on the left-hand side is an image from an article about a mosquito device campaign that the Scottish Youth Parliament ran. This is a campaign that I actually worked on when I was with the Youth Parliament. This was about devices called mosquito devices that produce a really high-pitched frequency noise that generally only young people can hear, because it's to do with hairs that are in your ears that fall off around a certain age, and so only really young people or children can hear them. So these devices are used in order to, I guess, discourage children and young people from hanging around certain spaces. They're often used as sort of antisocial behaviour devices. We had discovered a couple of these devices across train stations in Scotland, and as a result we put in some freedom of information requests across local authorities and discovered that actually there was a huge number of them being used across school buildings, playgrounds, as well as train stations and other spaces across Scotland. And we'd had a young person who had experienced these devices, and they'd said that it was actually almost painful to be in the vicinity of one of them. And you know, when you're in a train station, you've got no choice to be there because you have to wait for your train in order to get to wherever it is that you're going. And they were used in playgrounds after a certain time because they didn't want young people to be hanging around there at late hours of night. There's a huge range of rights that are being impacted here in terms of freedom from violence, freedom from cruel or degrading treatment, and also the right to play. It wasn't just for the discouragement of young teenagers and I guess people that they might be worried about that were causing antisocial behaviour in these spaces, but actually even babies were being impacted by these machines, and so it was quite an issue for us as the Youth Parliament. We didn't think that these devices were being used appropriately, and it wasn't something that was being regulated or monitored. So we actually wrote to ScotRail and a number of local authorities citing these rights that were being impacted, and as a result ScotRail banned the use of these devices across all of their stations. A number of local authorities, including Fife as well as Perth and Kinross, removed all devices across local authority buildings. As of 2022, no councils reported any device being used in local authority premises. And so that was a really, really great one, and for us we think the weight of actually saying these devices are really interfering with children and young people's right to freedom from violence, right to freedom from cruel and degrading treatment, that added a lot of weight to the arguments that we were making, and ultimately is what led ScotRail and local authorities to actually respond to our concerns and take action to remove these devices from a number of spaces. The second example that I'm going to show is a screenshot on the right hand side of the screen. The text is quite small, so I don't expect anyone to be able to read it, but we'll link to the actual blog itself in the further resources. It's an article written by the Scottish Independent Advocacy Alliance in response to Edinburgh Integration Joint Board's plan to make cuts to collective advocacy services. In the blog, they call the move legally questionable by making links to rights and legislation. So they referenced recent recommendations by the UN for the UK to meet its obligations under economic, social and cultural rights by strengthening mental health services and support systems by allocating sufficient resources and strengthening community-based supports. And they obviously pointed out that the cuts were in direct opposition to these recommendations. I really just wanted to highlight this blog because actually it sets out quite well how you can respond to a situation in which, for example, cuts are being made through using UN recommendations and other sort of language. Obviously they haven't gotten all of the outcomes that they want, but what it's allowed for is a sort of bigger ongoing conversation and of course a bit more attention and publicity to what's happened with the cuts in the area. So these are 2 examples of organisations taking problems that might be faced by anyone but taking them through a rights-based lens, and how for one case it's been able to produce really good results, and in the other it's perhaps not been able to produce as successful results, but it's still been able to draw a lot of attention to the issue and to give a bit more weight to it by framing it through human rights. So your next question might be, how do I find information for the advocacy? How do I know what rights to reference? How do I bring all of that language into what I'm doing? So we've given you a bit of an overview of the core human rights treaties and frameworks in the first half of this training, and you can find a lot more information out there in the further resources that we'll link to, as well as information in the handout that we provide. So you can look at the UN resources. There's a list of sort of websites that we'll link to, but I think actually what might be even more useful is the Scottish Government Human Rights Tracker. So there's a tiny little screenshot I've included on this slide here, but we'll link again to this site, and you'll be able to find every recommendation that has been given to the UK and Scotland by the various UN bodies. Once you get on there, you'll find that it's actually really accessible in how they've designed the tracker, and the recommendations themselves are quite useful in being able to directly input them into your work. So if you work with, let's say for example, you work with women and helping women get into the workforce, you can filter for women and employment, and through that you can find what recommendations the UN has made. So that might be things around equal pay, that might be things around gender-based discrimination in the workplace, and these are things that you can then directly input into reports that you're writing, consultations that you're responding to, and being able to link the arguments that you're making back to UN recommendations. And so I think that's quite a valuable resource, and I'd recommend that you go have a look at this after this training session. Nextly, you can look at organisations like the Scottish Human Rights Commission and experts in the third sector. I'll go into more detail on the next slide about what that looks like. So these organisations, these expert organisations, will often have already done the work in terms of linking issues that we face here in Scotland to UN recommendations and UN evidence. So a few examples I've got on screen here is Just Fair. They put out a brilliant report on the right to health in the UK. The second one in the middle, that is from Together, the Scottish Alliance on Children's Rights. Every year they publish a State of Children's Rights in Scotland report, which collects a huge range of case studies and evidence from organisations across Scotland working to support children and young people, and links those issues back to the UNCRC. And then the last one I've got here is from the Scottish Human Rights Commission. Last year they published a really great report on economic, social and cultural rights in the Highlands and Islands. And again, it is putting a spotlight on the issues that rural communities face in the Highlands and Islands, and linking those back to economic, social and cultural rights, and looking at whether or not there has been a failure in provision or where things have went well as well. So again, I think these are great resources, and we'll link to them all in the further resources, and some of these will also be mentioned in the handout as well that you can access after having a look at this training video. So that's just to say there's a lot of information out there, so I wouldn't necessarily worry too much about having to become completely fluent in translating the language of the UN, when there are quite a few expert organisations in Scotland that do that work on a regular basis.
So we're giving you quite a lot of information on taking rights forward, that kind of how to do rights. Please don't assume that we want you to have memorised it all. We do have separate resources on all of this, and we have a handout that will be downloadable from the description below. You might find that some of the frameworks that we're going to talk about might be more useful to you than others, so it's important to think about your specific work and what one would best serve you and your organisation. This slide sets out the 3 frameworks that we're going to take you through today. So if you've been on any of our other courses, you might be familiar with the first one on the left there, so that's the panel principles. Then we've got the AAAQ framework, followed by the FAIR approach. We've put a little guidance on what each framework might be used for there. So for panel, we have it can be used to integrate human rights and equalities work into your everyday practice. For AAAQ there, we've got it can be used for evaluating whether a right has been met. And then for the last one, the FAIR approach, we've got that it can be used for fact-finding or gathering evidence when rights haven't been met. It can also be for then kind of identifying that plan to move forward. So let's take a look at panel in a bit more depth. The panel principles are a tool that help you embody a human rights and equalities first approach, addressing that question of how does this apply to my everyday? So PANEL is an acronym that stands for Participation, Accountability, Non-Discrimination, Empowerment and Legality. You'll be able to see that on the slide there. So it's a tool that provides a really structured method of applying that human rights and equalities first approach, and it can also be applied before, after, and during moments of change. And it can be used as a moment of reflection just to ensure that your organisation is really aligned with human rights and equalities. It's an acronym, but controversially we are going to start with the end, so we're going to talk about legality first. And that is because the law is the floor and it's not the ceiling that you should aspire to. So legality is just kind of what it says on the tin. It's that all approaches should be grounded in legal protections, such as, say, the Equality Act of 2010. Back to the start, the way acronyms should work. We've got P, which stands for participation. So that means that people should be involved in decisions that affect their rights, and that is because they are best placed to say what will help fulfill their rights and what wouldn't. People are experts in their own experience. So this can be achieved through things like workshops, surveys, stakeholder groups, co-design projects, just as a few kind of examples there. We've then got accountability. So accountability is about monitoring how people's rights are affected by a policy or practice, and it's all about ensuring that there are remedies for when things go wrong. One way to ensure accountability is through equality and human rights impact assessments, which we do have a guide on that we can signpost to. And another important method is making sure that you have strong feedback channels. So making sure that you've got that kind of two-way dialogue with stakeholders at all times. We've then got non-discrimination. So non-discrimination states that all forms of discrimination must be prohibited, prevented, and eliminated. It also states that people who face the biggest barriers to realising their rights should be prioritised. And the last one I'm going to talk about here is empowerment. So that states that everyone should understand their rights and be fully supported to take part in processes that affect them. So it can be about informing people of mechanisms of remedy or how to escalate an issue if it hasn't been resolved, as well as kind of telling people about their rights. That kind of harks back to our last section where we talked about that kind of informing people, how important raising awareness on rights can be. We actually do have a course that goes into panel principles in depth, explaining how you can embed them into the kind of everyday work in your organisation, so you can check that out. So here we have a few examples of how the panel principles might be used in action. You will see we split these up into two columns, so we've got internal and then external. First, let's take a look at internal. So you might use this kind of tool to help structure the development of your new policies, or maybe it will help inform your decision making when it comes to like big decisions in your organisation, or even small ones. Panel can be a really useful guiding tool to make sure that you are in line with human rights and equalities, whether that be something like moving offices or providing tech to your staff or service users, or even organising work parties. It can also be a great tool to review how you've been doing on a project and use it to kind of reflect on any changes you might want to make. And last one on the kind of internal examples is funding applications. So more and more funders are looking for organisations to really show their commitment to human rights and equalities, and to do that in their funding applications. So you can jot down the panel principles in your responses and kind of list your practices and values under each one. We actually have a short webinar recording on our website on how to fill out funding application questions that chat about human rights and equalities. So you can check that out on our website. Externally, you might use panel for things like helping you in the process of filling out equality and human rights impact assessments. If you're an organisation that works around policy, you can use it as a framework for explaining why you may or may not support a decision. In partnership working, it can be really useful to make sure that everyone's on the same page when it comes to human rights and equalities. And if you're reviewing those services that you provide, it can be a really useful tool. Okay, so let's talk through a specific example on how this approach could be used. Say you run a weekly wellbeing group for LGBTQ young people, and you might be looking at reviewing your service and seeing whether it's doing well. Well, in this case, you could probably use the panel principles to do so. So, starting off with participation, we might think about who are the best people to kind of tell us about whether the service is running well, and that would be the young people themselves. So it might be about setting up some focus groups or running some anonymous surveys. As long as the people benefiting from or are impacted by the service are involved in the process, then you'll be thinking about doing participation and you'll be doing it well. So accountability, that's our second panel principle there. So what are the ways for young people to bring up issues or complaints if they do have any? Maybe you could think about when people register to attend, you could ensure that there is a note of a phone number or other contact details for a safeguarding person, so that they could always have that contact, and if they had an issue they wouldn't have to come up to the person that maybe is the person that they're trying to contact about. Then we have non-discrimination, so you might think about what groups might find it more difficult to access your group. Is the venue wheelchair friendly? Is it easily accessible by public transport? Doing a kind of run through of key groups who might have access issues can help you identify who might be being left out. And then we have empowerment. So some groups will put together something called like a charter of rights, where they pick out a few rights where they feel like are really important to them in that space. So for example, with children and young people, the right to be heard and to have your opinion listened to might be highlighted as an important one for how adults should be kind of interacting with them in that space. And this just refers to using any kind of available opportunities to build up rights knowledge and confidence. And finally, legality. So that's about making sure that your legal duties have been followed. So this could include things like making sure that staff have their PVGs in place, and maybe getting staff up to speed on basic information like the UNCRC that we talked about earlier. So that's just a few quick examples on how you might use panel. Maybe we'll now move into our next framework, which is called the AAAQ. Okay, so the AAAQ framework is another one that you might want to have under your belt. This is useful for identifying whether or not a right is actually being held up in practice, and it can be a good framework to have in mind if you're involved in consultations or feeding into decision making with local authorities or other public sector bodies. So the first A we've got here is availability, and this is checking that there is enough of a service or a resource available for that right to be fulfilled. Then we have accessibility, so that means that people can reach and use support without discrimination or unaffordable costs. Our last A is acceptability, so that's all about making sure that the design and delivery are appropriate and respectful, with adaptations where they may be needed. And we've got Q at the end there, so that's quality, meaning that the support is competent and safe and achieves outcomes. So let's think about that in terms of an example, to kind of bring it back into that kind of third sector world. We can think about the right to housing. So there might be sufficient stock and it might be of good quality and acceptability, but if it's not got the necessary adaptations for someone with limited mobility, then it's not accessible and that right is not being met. There was a piece of work done by the Scottish Human Rights Commission with Leith housing tenants, and they were living in really awful conditions. And while there was certainly an availability of housing stock technically, the actual quality of the living conditions were not good quality, as there was black mould growing in many of the flats, and there were lifts broken which made it inaccessible. As for acceptability, if we're thinking about that example of right to housing again, if you're housing a young family, there needs to be access to local schools or play parks, and it may be better to house young families on a street with low traffic. Another example would be if you were housing someone who's Sikh, you might want to consider whether there's a local Gurdwara, or so that people aren't travelling really ridiculous amounts to access their right to freedom of religion or belief while maintaining their right to housing. And that highlights a really important point in the kind of interrelatedness of rights, in that providing housing that doesn't meet the AAAQ standards can impact on other rights. So for example, the right to health if houses are full of mould, or the right to education if families are really far from schools, or the right to freedom of religion or belief if people are unreasonable distances away from a place of worship. So we can see here that it's not as simple as have a house, have the right to housing. It's why the AAAQ framework is really useful and can help you articulate rights in a much clearer way. So some settings where you might use this framework would be when you're filling out consultation responses, or when you're filling out impact assessments, or if you're doing advocacy work for a group, particularly when things have went wrong and you can notice that there's an issue with a right not being met, but you need to be able to articulate it in specific ways. It can be a really useful framework. So our final framework that we're going to talk about today is the FAIR framework, and this can be used for fact-finding or analysing when a right has not been met. So I'll go ahead and read out what each of those letters stand for. So we've got facts, so that is the collating the experiences of those involved and kind of identifying what the important facts are to understand the situation. Then we have analysing your rights, so kind of like taking an analysis of what different rights might be affected. And then we identify responsibilities, so identifying who, what needs to be done and who's responsible for doing it. And then we have review actions, so that's making recommendations for actions and kind of later recall and evaluate what has happened as a result. So we might, as an example, go back to the video we watched earlier on the advocacy project, where Patricia wasn't able to use equipment at the hospital as they didn't have inclusive sizing. So applying the FAIR framework to this situation, we might see what are the facts here. Patricia was not receiving the care that she needs, forcing her to provide her own equipment. Moving on to analyse, the rights at stake here would definitely be the right to health, with Patricia being unable to access basic facilities at the hospital without the appropriate equipment. And then we have identification of responsibilities. So the hospital should have definitely taken responsibility for the provision of this equipment in the first place. And finally, with reviewing actions, what they did after was they realised that Patricia's situation was not an isolated one, and they ordered a range of equipment that is more accessible for people of different heights and prevented any situations like this happening in the future. So this is a very quick example of FAIR in action, but we will link to further information on further resources. So that was really a whistle-stop tour through those key frameworks you can have to applying human rights and equalities into your work. Just as a reminder, we do have a set of separate resources on panel, and we will link to further resources on the AAAQ and FAIR frameworks. So we hope we've given you a few guiding frameworks on how you can use rights in your work. We personally think that Panel is a very great everyday tool that can be used in a range of settings, so we would personally say that you should maybe start with that one. But of course, if your work does involve more advocacy or accountability work, you might think about the AAAQ framework or the FAIR framework. They might be exactly what you need. But we wanted to give you a real range of frameworks to take away and consider what would best suit your work.
So that brings us to the end of the main content for this training session. We're just going to highlight some key organisations that you might want to go to for more information, particularly on specific issue areas. So for example, Together, the Scottish Alliance for Children's Rights, they publish a range of yearly reports on children's rights issues in Scotland. Making Rights Real on Screen, they do their own support and advocacy, so they've been doing a fantastic series on housing rights, working with residents of social housing in Leith in Edinburgh. I'd recommend looking at their website for some great examples of rights-based work. That's just two examples I picked out here, but all the organisations on screen, you'll find a wealth of information on their websites that will help you in your rights journey. So just coming back to those aims that we looked at the beginning of this course, we said we were going to help you to understand the legal frameworks that underpin human rights at the international, UK and Scottish levels, understand what the role of the third sector is in human rights practice in Scotland and the UK, and how to build rights into your practice using a range of frameworks and practical examples. We hopefully have achieved that with all of the information that we've given you. As a reminder, you've also got a handout that's available, and if you would actually like to experience this course in a live format with other people on the course and with some interactivity and breakout rooms, you can sign up to our live delivery sessions on our website at any time. So we're just going to end on a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was really crucial to the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and she said, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world." We really like this quote. It really guides our work and our approach really strongly, and I think it's a good reminder that human rights are for the people that we work with, for the communities that we support. They're not faraway ideals, but actually they can be real grounding principles that can strengthen the good work that is going on across the third sector. We hope the information that we've shared throughout this course is useful to you and can support you to have more confidence in engaging with human rights and using them as a practical tool to support your work. Human rights aren't, they're not a panacea, they're not going to fix absolutely everything, but they're a really, really useful tool to have in terms of advocacy, in terms of talking about the work that you do to funders. There's many, many reasons that having a stronger rights knowledge will only benefit yourself, your organisation, and the people that you support. Thank you for following along on this 3 online course. You can get more 3 resources on our website at thre.org.uk. If you'd like to get in contact with us for whatever reason, you can email us at thre@gcbs.org.uk. Thank you.